This episode of Literacy Live is part of a pre-recorded webinar series entitled Leading a Balanced Reading Assessment System. This episode is all about identifying data sources within your school or district's balanced assessment system that will assist in making an initial specific learning disabilities eligibility decision. We do recommend that you watch a prior episode, Conducting a Literacy Assessment Review, before learning from this episode. For this episode, DPI literacy consultants Barb Novak and
Laura Adams
will be joined by our colleagues, DPI school psychology consultant Kathryn and DPI special education consultant for specific learning disabilities, Deb Heiss. The purpose of this webinar series, Leading a Balanced Reading Assessment System, is to answer the following questions. What is assessment? What do we measure? What do we use the data for? And how do we communicate about assessment? This episode, specifically about data for an initial SLD eligibility decision, really focuses on what do we measure, what do we use the data for, and how do we communicate about assessment. During this webinar, you will learn about an overview of the SLD eligibility criteria, the role of reviewing existing data in making an initial SLD eligibility decision, and we'll talk about the data required in an eligibility decision. This includes observations, probes or progress monitoring, an individually administered achievement test, and formal and informal data. We'll wrap up the webinar by discussing the eligibility decision and report.
So let's actually begin by situating making an SLD eligibility decision within a broader multi-level system of support or response to intervention system. And this graphic we hope you are familiar with. This graphic that you see on the screen now is the one that depicts Wisconsin's vision for a multi-level system of support, or an RTI system. And as you've probably heard both Barb and I say in the past, this graphic really makes us very proud to work in Wisconsin. So we really want to call your attention to the fact that Wisconsin chooses not to use a triangle for its overall vision of RTI. Instead, it's a more circular graphic to really represent that wraparound, that idea of wraparound supports to meet the needs of all learners. Within that system of wraparound supports, we have three primary components: collaboration, balanced assessment, and high quality instruction. And of course, running through the middle, and what makes Wisconsin's vision of RTI the most unique is culturally responsive practices. And we recorded a previous webinar about culturally responsive practices. And so if you have any questions about what that means, and specifically what that may mean when you're thinking about your balanced reading assessment system, please view that earlier webinar.
So one of the things about your multi-level system of support is that it serves a variety of different purposes. It exists to ensure that all students have an equal opportunity for success. A district or school can choose to design their multi-level system of support so that it's also leading to the collection and analysis of data that one would need in an initial SLD eligibility decision. But again, that's a district decision, how you actually design the details of your MLSS or RTI system.
So when we're talking about making that SLD eligibility decision, we're really talking about one particular piece of your broader multi-level system of support, or RTI system. So here's a graphic of a triangle, and this graphic of a triangle is not meant to represent the fact that a school should have 5 different levels in their multi-level system of support or RTI system. It's really just meant to represent the idea that a comprehensive multi-level system of support includes various levels with increasing levels of intensity, and that could be intensity of interventions or additional challenges as well. So that generally includes some kind of a level representing the universal instruction for all students or core curriculum. It may include an additional effective classroom-based strategies for some students, all the way to that most intensive level, which would be here at the top of this particular triangle, targeted high-intensity intervention for a very few number of students. And as you can see on the one side of the graphic, there's a clear arrow showing that this would really increase in intensity. On the other side of the triangle, you can see that throughout all of these different levels, which your district may choose to have or may not, throughout all of these different levels, you would have research-based, culturally responsive, differentiated practices.
I'm glad that we include this triangle when we talk about response to intervention or multi-level system of support, because I think it emphasizes that school districts can choose to build in interventions and progress monitoring tools that meet the requirements of Wisconsin's SLD eligibility criteria. A district or school can choose to build that into their MLSS or their RTI system, but their entire system doesn't need to be built around those criteria. So a multi-level system of support, a response to intervention system, is very robust, and it's meant to meet the needs of all students, from students who are in need of academic intervention to students who are in need of academic enrichment. All of that is encompassed within an MLSS, and a very small portion of that MLSS is about collecting, providing interventions and collecting progress monitoring data that would meet the requirements of the SLD eligibility criteria.
So this graphic is another way to consider a multi-level system of support that responds to the needs of all learners. And so here, what this graphic is really trying to represent, first of all, we see the definition here on the screen that comes to us from our partners at the Wisconsin RTI Center of a multi-level system of support or response to intervention system. And really this graphic is representing the idea that we know that we have these three particular components of a multi-level system of support, and all three of those components intensify when we are providing interventions.
So instruction, collaboration, and assessment are all intensifying as we're providing intervention or enrichment. So it's not just about providing intense intervention, it's also about intensifying the collaboration and intensifying the assessment.
Exactly. And here you may also need to consider, again, your culturally responsive practices. And perhaps that may be one reason why a learner is not responding to instruction.
So why have we just spent all of this time talking about a multi-level system of support and response to intervention? We promised you a webinar about SLD eligibility decisions. Why have we spent all this time on RTI? It's because you can establish your RTI system or your MLSS in a way that allows you to provide interventions that meet the needs of students and the requirements of the SLD eligibility criteria, and to assess how students are doing with those interventions, whether or not they're making progress. You can build that all into your RTI system or your MLSS system. But you need to remember that that's not the sole purpose of RTI or a multi-level system of support. It's just a small portion of it. In addition to that, there are some specific data sources that are required within an SLD eligibility determination, and we'll talk in great detail about those in this webinar. But you can also build your balanced assessment system in a way that ensures that you're collecting the data you need in the event of an SLD eligibility determination. So next, our friend and colleague Deb Heiss will talk about the, give you an overview of the SLD eligibility criteria.
Hi, I'm Deb Heiss, the Specific Learning Disabilities Consultant here at DPI, and I'm very pleased to be with my colleagues here this afternoon to talk with you about SLD eligibility decisions and how that can fit into a lot of the data that you're gathering as you do your important work in literacy. So we're going to be talking, as Barb said, about that small percentage of students for whom, despite the involvement of a robust multi-level system of support, are still striving to meet grade level expectations. And so a team of people may be convened to make a SLD eligibility decision. This graphic shows an overview of the entire process. On one side are the three criteria in Wisconsin's Specific Learning Disabilities Rule to determine eligibility. So the three components there are insufficient progress in the blue box, inadequate classroom achievement in the reddish colored box, and then those two elements are viewed through the lens of exclusionary factors. And exclusionary factors may be other reasons that the student is not achieving or the student hasn't made adequate progress in response to an intervention. So these exclusionary factors include considerations such as the student is an English language learner, or the student has been absent from school for a long time. These are lenses because these are factors that may influence a student's performance, and they need to be considered to see if those are the primary reasons the student is not achieving or is not making adequate progress. The team looks at these three equally weighted factors to decide the answer to that first question. Does the student have an educational impairment? And if there is an impairment, then the team answers the question, is there a need for special education? Those two questions are the purview of the IEP team, and those questions really aren't any different for students with suspected specific learning disabilities. As you know from being involved in IEP teams, those are the two questions that are asked for every student. In this SLD rule in Wisconsin, there are some clear benefits. One is certainly that decision making is based on how a student is responding to high quality instruction. So we're looking at the kind of optimal learning conditions for the student and whether that helps the student to learn. In doing this, it really places a focus on teaching and learning, and it also provides an authentic opportunity to help children earlier. And finally, SLD rule, this way of looking at eligibility, provides an authentic opportunity to help children earlier. In other words, there's not a wait and fail type of situation, but the interventions can be provided when the team decides there are questions about the student's performance. So we've looked at that overview of SLD eligibility criteria. Now let's look at the review of existing data. What is the purpose of this review of existing data, and what data might be considered? The team needs to review existing data. It is not required that a meeting is hosted. However, if a meeting is called to review the existing data, it should include all members of the IEP team, and that would include the parents, of course. The purpose of this review is at least twofold. One is to look at the data that's available to the team and determine what, if any, additional data is needed to make this SLD eligibility determination. So that might include things like looking at the student's strengths and interests, and that would be in school and out of school. What achievement data is available to date about the student? Might be progress monitoring, grades, standardized achievement tests, perhaps prior evaluations. What is the student's attendance history and the student's engagement history? So has the student really been involved with the curriculum? What educational services and interventions have already been tried? Has the student, for instance, participated in Title I? What's known about the student's academic language proficiency level? Any health data, that really should be first in the list actually, right? You'd want to rule out that there are any visual or hearing acuity difficulties. And what information can the family provide? Do they work with homework a lot? Has the student had some significant health history? What kind of life experiences are possible? So you can tell that there's a myriad types of data and amounts of data that the IEP team can look at to help make this eligibility determination, to help see what's available and what's needed. The second purpose of the review of existing data is to determine what area or areas of concern is the team going to examine. In some situations, this may have been determined before the review of existing data. In other cases, not. So this slide shows this review of existing data all at once. Up on top is the purposes of the review of existing data, and here are the 3 areas of criterion in the SLD rule. These are the types of data that would be available in each of those areas. So that just tells you a little bit more information about the review of existing data. Let's look at these areas of concern. In Wisconsin's SLD rule, as in the federal law, there are listed 8 areas of academic achievement that may be the area of primary concern. So there may be 1 or more areas of concern here, and you can see on this slide that 6 of these 8 areas are related to literacy. So literacy is clearly an important area of potential concern here. Basic skills in reading, reading fluency, reading comprehension probably are some of the most frequent areas of concern that IEP teams designate. For the IEP team to move forward, and this is something that may happen at the review of existing data and in conversation with the person who initiated the referral, the area or areas of concern for this evaluation are going to be identified. Each of the areas that is identified will then likely be paired with an intervention. So Laura is going to talk next about some of the data that are required to make an eligibility decision for specific learning disabilities.
So after that very nice overview of the SLD rule itself, that SLD kind of rule in a nutshell that we were presented with by Deb Heiss, we're now going to turn our attention to data that's required in an eligibility decision. So we're going to work through the 4 different types of data. We're going to briefly talk about each one. So the required pieces of data include observations, probes, which of course are our means of progress monitoring the intensive interventions that a student is engaged in the area or areas of concern, an individually administered achievement test, and formal and informal data. So data prescribed by the rule needs to be of the highest validity and reliability possible. As we said earlier, we're making a pretty high stakes decision. So obviously we want to really be able to count on the data to tell us what we need to know about the student in order to make this decision and move forward. It's important to note that the individually administered achievement test happens after 2 scientific, research-based or evidence-based interventions have been implemented. There are 2 types of observations that are required as part of the collection of data to determine whether a child has a specific learning disability. And so these observations, the 2 observations, are conducted for that initial eligibility determination. It's important to note that the purpose of the observation is to observe the student's response to universal instruction and the student's response to the intervention. The purpose of the observation is not to measure whether or not instruction or intervention is being administered with fidelity. And because we're observing the student's response to the instruction or intervention, it's most appropriate for that person who's conducting the observation to not be the person who's delivering that universal instruction or intervention. And there's a wide variety of school personnel who would be qualified to conduct that observation. So when we're thinking about these 2 observations, one is the systemic observation of the student during routine instruction in the area of concern, and this is required for both initial evaluations and re-evaluations. The other observation is at least one systematic observation of the student during the intensive scientific, research, or evidence-based intervention. This is required when considering SLD for the first time during evaluations of students who are enrolled in public schools. So the purpose, again, of the observation is to gather data about how the student performs during general education classroom instruction and during the intervention in the area or areas of concern. This information can be very helpful in understanding the student's strengths and weaknesses and what other factors might be interfering with learning. The term systematic observation, you see it here on the screen or on the slide, is not defined by the Wisconsin rule. In the literature, systematic observation generally refers to a method of measuring classroom behavior related to a student's learning using direct observation in a natural setting. There's some important guidance for conducting a systematic observation that includes but is not limited to generally accepted practices, which would include planning the observation in advance, collecting specific data during the observation, identifying target behaviors prior to the observation, as well as a recording system that would be selected by the observer. And the data collected would focus on behaviors and skills that are directly related to the area or areas of concern identified, in this case, for the referred students. So there are some examples that are provided both on DPI's SLD webpage, which you can find via the link that sits next to this webinar. Next, we're going to hear from DPI's school psychology consultant, Dr. Kathryn Bush, about progress monitoring associated with the SLD eligibility rule.
Hello, I'm Kathryn Bush. I'm the school psychology consultant for the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction. I'm going to talk a little bit with you about the data that is required for specific learning disabilities eligibility decisions. But first we're going to talk about progress monitoring in general. Progress monitoring is quite simply monitoring a student's response to an intervention or to additional challenges or even to core instruction. So there are many types of progress monitoring, and each produces valuable data for the purpose that it is designed. However, Wisconsin's specific learning disabilities eligibility criteria has very specific requirements for progress monitoring. Progress monitoring is a term used in both multi-level system of support and in the specific learning disabilities rule. So next will be two definitions in these two contexts. The one on this slide is from the Wisconsin Response to Intervention Center, or Wisconsin RTI Center. And it talks about progress monitoring used to assess students' academic and behavioral performance, to measure student responsiveness to interventions, challenges, and to evaluate the effectiveness of those interventions and challenges. So in this slide, we're looking specifically at progress monitoring data that meets the requirements of the specific learning disabilities rule. And in the SLD rule, a progress monitoring probe is defined as one that is brief and direct measure of specific academic skills, multiple, equal, or nearly equal forms. And it's sensitive to small changes in student performance. It provides valid and reliable measures of performance during intervention. The data from probes are what the Individual Educational Programming Team, or IEP team, uses to decide if the student meets the insufficient progress criteria. The probes used must provide valid and reliable data about the area or areas of concern that are the target of the intervention. The data must allow the IEP team to compare the progress of the student being evaluated to the expected performance for students of the same age or grade. In the specific learning disabilities rule, probe data are compared to norms based on expectations for the student's peers. So we use what are called grade level probes. In determining if a student has specific learning disabilities, it is necessary to examine the difference between the student's current level of performance and the expected performance we would anticipate at the student's grade placement. So a comparison to only the student's instructional level allows data about the learner's own progress for the instructional level at which the student is working. However, it's not a good indicator of the rate of progress toward grade level expectations. It does not indicate the degree of the gap between the student's achievement and that expected of peers, and whether that gap is closing. It does not provide information that allows an IEP team to estimate how long it's going to take for the student to reach grade level expectations. And while data about instructional level are useful for some purposes, such as whether the student is learning skills being taught at the student's instructional level, it does not answer the required specific learning disabilities question about insufficient progress, and thus does not meet the data requirements for analyzing the insufficient progress criteria as defined by the specific learning disabilities rule. But as with interventions, not all progress monitoring practices used within general education must meet the definition in the specific learning disabilities rule, and not all progress monitoring of student learning must use grade level probes for collecting progress data. However, when a specific learning disabilities eligibility decision is to be made, progress monitoring data collected using probes that meet the definition of standards in the specific learning disability rule must be available to the IEP team for analysis. Monitoring progress is an important component of daily instruction that involves the collection and review of ongoing data to guide instruction. These data points can be both formal and informal data that inform core instruction as well as interventions above and beyond core instruction. Schools and districts can choose to design their multi-level system of support in a way that ensures the interventions and progress monitoring at the most intensive level of support, so near the top of the triangle, meet Wisconsin's requirements for making specific learning disabilities eligibility determination. The specific learning disabilities rule includes requirements for progress monitoring and for the tools used for progress monitoring, that is probes, to consider the insufficient progress criterion when specific learning disabilities eligibility is being considered for the first time. The insufficient progress criterion of the specific learning disabilities rule is decided using probe data. However, as good consumers of data, we want the preponderance of other formal and informal data to be consistent with the probe data when determining whether a student should be identified as having a specific learning disability. Here's a sample graph which demonstrates probe scores from curriculum-based measure for reading. The top red line demonstrates the expected growth of same grade peers at the lower ends of typical progress. The blue dots represent the probe data. The dotted line going through the blue dots represents the student's trend line. In this case, the gap is widening between the student's progress and that of the student's peers. Notice that there is no goal line on this chart because the goal line, while important in other uses, is irrelevant when determining insufficient progress criterion in the specific learning disabilities rule. And now we'll be joined again by Deb and Barb.
So the third criterion in the SLD eligibility considerations is inadequate classroom achievement. And this is assessed through an individually administered achievement test. It's really important to note that this test is administered after the 2 intensive interventions have been completed. And that is so that the child may benefit from the full impact of those interventions prior to the achievement test administration. The achievement test needs to be as reliable and valid as it can be, and it needs to be a norm referenced measure because we're looking to see if this inadequate achievement is not what one would expect for the student's age level. It should be a test that is matched to the area or areas of concern. So for instance, if the area of concern was reading fluency, then an achievement test in reading fluency is going to be a requirement. Please check the technical guide for each assessment to see who can administer the test. most reliable publishers are going to tell you the type of training that the test administrator needs to have. This test would require written parent permission if it hasn't been obtained earlier in the process. And I've been getting a lot of phone calls, so I want to just emphasize that for this achievement test, age norms should be used unless the child's age is well outside the age range in his or her particular grade. So for instance, if the child had been retained twice, then grade norms might be used. But age norms is the way to go.
Lots of details to think about. Wow. So we have talked about some of the data sources required in an SLD eligibility decision. We've talked about observations, we've talked about progress monitoring data, a really specific kind of progress monitoring data collected with the tool that our rule refers to as a probe. Deb just talked about the individually administered achievement test that happens after the interventions have been completed. Now, I just want to remind everyone that there are also formal and informal data sources that can be part of your eligibility decision. So beginning with the review of existing data meeting that was referenced earlier in the webinar, the team can start to consider what additional formal and informal assessment data may be included in the eligibility decision. So when I'm talking about additional data, I'm talking about things like student work samples, especially writing samples, maybe recordings of students' oral reading that could be played for the IEP team, maybe running records that could be explained to the IEP team, maybe a reading interview to get a feel for what motivates and engages the student, maybe teacher anecdotal notes collected during reading conferences as part of the universal curriculum, maybe even the student's reading log. So again, you can start to think about what you want these additional data sources to be as early as the review of existing data meeting. But again, you'd want those data sources to match the area of concern. You'd want them to tell you more about the area, which of those
Absolutely.
8 areas that you're really examining. If you're looking for more information about this, I do recommend that you take a look at DPI's technical guide for SLD eligibility determinations. There's a specific section of that guide that is called, I just want to read it to you so I make sure I get it right, Required Data Sources for Evaluation Activities, Formal and Informal Sources of Data. So that does provide a little bit more information for you. The purpose of an evaluation is to get the student the services that he or she needs to meet and exceed grade level expectations. And we want to make sure that we're using all of the data possible to really get a robust view, a robust picture of who a student is at a given point in time. So if the data are consistent or inconsistent, that's something, if there's inconsistencies in the data, that is something that the IEP team needs to work through, and those inconsistencies would need to be resolved before the findings meeting can reach a conclusion. So next, Deb is going to talk with us a bit about the eligibility decision and report.
So a great deal of information has been compiled, and now the IEP team is going to meet. The IEP team is made up of individuals who are knowledgeable about the child and who can present and interpret the data and other information about the student's performance and related factors and make decisions based on these data. For an initial SLD evaluation, IEP team members must include the student's parent or parents, at least one of the student's general education teachers, at least one special education teacher, an LEA representative, and so on. In addition, for an initial SLD evaluation, the IEP team members must include an individual who implemented the intensive interventions with a student, an individual who completed the required observations, and a person qualified to assess progress data. Finally, an individual qualified to conduct the individual diagnostic evaluations needs to be included. When you look at that list of team members, please be aware that one team member can fill more than one of these goals, or you so
You wouldn't have a room big enough
that's
to
right.
house everyone.
It just depends on who are the people who are involved in the evaluations, but it's really critical to make sure that each of those roles is documented there. So once the IP team has collected and reviewed all of the available data, it needs to make an eligibility decision and, importantly, document that decision. So if the IP team determines the student has an impairment, as we talked about earlier, it must go on to answer that second question as to whether the child needs special education. The Department of Public Instruction has provided sample forms, including forms to document SLD eligibility that districts may use in their decision making. But this is not a requirement. These are sample forms. A lot of districts do choose to use them because then they're just assured they have all the components available. So when making that eligibility decision, in addition to all of the required data, the achievement test, the progress monitoring, the observations, as Barb talked about already, there are many other types of data that can be
the formal and informal data sources.
So to bring that all in, we're looking to create a rich portrait of that learner and make sure that if it's necessary, enough information is available to go ahead and write a subsequent IP or provide follow-up interventions. So all of this information is documented in the form. It's not necessary to include data in more than one place on the forms, and you can append information to the form. So for example, the information from the systematic observation, the summary data, might be attached to the form. But it's all included as part of the IP team assessment report, and that becomes part of the documentation.
To ultimately support the decisions that have been made by the team. So I think one of the things that Deb has pointed out for us is that this IP team could potentially be a very large team of people looking at a very large amount of data. The data might say a lot of different things about a student. It might send a consistent message. It might send an inconsistent message. So collaboration is a hugely important part of this process. And Laura Adams is going to come back to the webinar and talk with you a bit about collaboration.
As Barb said, I'm going to talk about the important place of collaboration in the SLD eligibility decision-making process. I feel like I've been talking a lot about collaboration lately, and I also feel like it's a bit ironic that I'm here by myself talking about collaboration, but that's okay. So if we think about what we know about collaboration and the fact that it's very important as educators, we feel it's very important for our students to learn how to collaborate with one another. And all of the reasons why that is for college, career, community success in the future. So obviously the same thing is true for us as professionals and colleagues. So collaboration requires school teams to problem solve. It's not an easy decision to make, as we talked about before, and sometimes you may have conflicting pieces of data, and so you really need to be able to rely on your relationships and collaboration processes in order to problem solve around some of the potential issues that may arise during the eligibility decision-making process. Collaboration obviously provides an opportunity for teams to learn about the child using effective evidence-based teaching methods. And I think it also provides a means for us of learning about our colleagues and the viewpoints of our colleagues, what our colleagues may value, like the types of evidence that they may value and why. And I feel like they may have some things to teach us about that, and we should be open to that. Collaboration also requires the use of data to assess the student's learning and make decisions. We need to all work together. So any IEP team member can disagree with the decision of a team. However, disagreement in front of the family and/or the student may erode confidence in the LEA's ability to meet the student's needs. So consider utilizing a protocol for disagreement that respects each team member's individual rights while also setting the LEA or the school district up for a successful and productive IEP team meeting. and more importantly, ongoing relationships, both with the student and his or her family. So some protocols that you could put into place beforehand would include some kind of a process for being organized. Obviously, we're talking about lots of different forms of data, lots of information about the child in question. It's important to have a process in place for sharing and discussing data, and when doing so, using language that's accessible and engaging for all team members. It was really interesting. I recently had the opportunity of being at the Wisconsin RTI Summit, and I was talking to a public librarian who was there, really talking about the supports between public and school libraries, and she was really overwhelmed by the number of acronyms that she heard in this professional learning environment, most of which she had no idea what they referred to or what they meant. And I think that that's something really important for us as educators to keep in mind. A lot of terms and acronyms, the names of programs or assessments, they just roll off our tongues and we don't even think about it. And so I think it's really important to take a step back and imagine someone, a family member or a student coming into a meeting, and what is it that they need to know, and how can it be explained to them in a meaningful, respectful, and engaging way. So next we're going to hear one more time from Kathryn Bush, and then Barb is going to be wrapping us up today.
One of the things we do is we make an eligibility decision and we write a report. So we want to think about the kinds of things that might happen at a meeting where we make that eligibility decision.
We have taken quite the journey in this webinar. We've talked in depth about what is involved in making an SLD eligibility decision, an initial SLD eligibility decision. We've talked about the review of existing data. We've talked about the data required in an eligibility decision, specifically observations, probes, progress monitoring data, individually administered achievement tests, and formal and informal data sources, which all come together to help the IEP team understand who the student is as a learner and whether or not that student has an impairment that could benefit from the services of special education. So I do encourage you to form a team in your school, a diverse team in your school. Go back and look at all of the assessments that are part of your balanced reading assessment system and think about what's required in an SLD eligibility decision. Do you have observations built into your assessment system somewhere? Do you have lots of different forms of progress monitoring data? Remember earlier in the webinar, Laura showed the triangle that intensified progress monitoring as intervention intensified. So does your system include a lot of different kinds of progress monitoring data? And do you have progress monitoring tools that meet the requirements of the SLD rule that would qualify as a probe? Do you have those progress monitoring tools to meet all of the 8 areas of concern that could be looked at in an eligibility decision? Do you have individually administered achievement tests included somewhere in your reading balanced assessment system? Do they match up with the 8 areas of concern in the SLD rule? Do you have formal and informal data included in your balanced literacy assessment system? I'm guessing you probably have plenty of that within your balanced literacy assessment system. But really, coming up with the data that you need for an initial eligibility decision shouldn't be an accident, and it shouldn't be haphazard. It should be very systematic. You already know what those pieces are. They're built into your assessment system. But I think it's really important to remember that we are most likely talking about a very small percentage of students, a very small percentage of our overall population. So we have this robust multi-level system of support or response to intervention system that provides many different kinds of interventions and many different kinds of data sources and many different kinds of progress monitoring tools. And some of those interventions and progress monitoring tools and assessments meet the requirements that are set forth in Wisconsin's SLD eligibility criteria. And like we do at the end of every one of our webinars, I just think it's so important to remember that what we talked about in this episode is just a very small fraction of everything that's important about developing reading, writing, speaking, listening, and language skills. We are creating students who are not just proficient readers, writers, speakers, and listeners, but also students who want to do those things. Students who want to read, want to write, want to use language, and students who see that those are beneficial to them in careers, beneficial to them in post-secondary settings, and quite frankly, beneficial in their desire to make their communities a better place for them to live and for their friends and colleagues to live. So I'm looking around the room because although you can't tell it, we're all together here in the same room recording this webinar. We all believe that you have to have a robust system and that making an initial SLD eligibility decision is a small part of that overall system. So as always, you have our contact information, phone number, and email. Please call us with your questions. Share your success stories with us. Share your struggles with us. We are always there for you to provide as much assistance as we can as you make local decisions about how to implement this rule.